was 3:15 a.m. I woke up from a terrible screech from above. There was a feeling that the neighbors living on the floor above, looking at the night, decided to arrange a total showdown. And this is 4 hours before Monday working day. I must note that the family was still the same. An eternally drunk asshole who reeked of a cocktail of sweat and fumes 200 meters away, his fattening wife, always making scenes with breaking dishes and throwing smelly things out the window, and the triumph of their life together, their 20-year-old son Ivan with Down syndrome. His favorite pastime was to run around the entrance and press the bell buttons in all the apartments, from which he apparently received incredible pleasure. Getting out of bed and muttering something obscene and dissatisfied, I went to the kitchen. Turning on the light there, lit a cigarette, drank a glass of water, and looked out the window. It was a warm, starry summer night. It was dark. There were no people. Of course, it's 4 o'clock. It's interesting, but apart from the squeal that woke me up, I didn't hear any signs of activity. So I threw the bull out the window and went to my bed to crawl under the covers and continue watching my amazing good dreams, which had nothing to do with the dull Monday afternoon. Before I could close my eyes, I jumped out of bed from a crash from above, as if something very heavy had fallen. I thought the ceiling was going to collapse. Even the whitewash fell a little on my bed. I quickly pulled on my jeans. I was in a bad mood. I wanted to sleep, but no. I need to go to the drunk neighbors to find out what happened there. Having opened the front door, I discovered that there was no light in the entrance, and given that it was night outside, absolutely nothing was visible. The light bulb must have burned out again. Taking a flashlight from the nightstand, I set off to meet my nightly adventures. Having risen 1 floor higher, he approached the shabby wooden door of the ill-fated family. It was clear from the door peephole that there was a light on in the corridor of their apartment. After hesitating for a couple of seconds, I pressed the call button. There was no response. I called again. Nothing. Well, screw him, he said quietly, and was just about to turn around to leave when he noticed that the dim light emanating from the peephole had disappeared. Someone was standing on the other side of the door and looking right at me. Finally, I thought, and was about to see the owner of the apartment, barely standing on his feet and trying to explain what had happened. But there was no action. I stood in the dark entrance with a flashlight in my hands, realizing that someone was watching me from the other side of the door. I assessed the situation from the outside and felt uneasy, and deciding that the best option would be to return to my apartment, I turned around and moved towards the stairs, lighting the way with a flashlight. The feeling of being watched from behind never left me. There was a desire to run, but I restrained myself, calming myself with the thoughts that there had already been a million similar situations with this unhealthy family, and now a drunk ass to death was standing at the door and could not do anything more than stand and hold on so as not to fall. When I stepped onto the stairs, something happened that gave me goosebumps. With a characteristic creak, the door near which I had just been standing slightly opened. When I stopped, I froze and felt my heart begin to beat twice as fast. Gathering my willpower into a fist, I turned around and shined the flashlight towards the door. It was slightly open and, as it seemed banal, there were no signs of life. "Is there anyone alive?" I asked jokingly in a trembling voice. Of course, no reaction. After standing like that for a minute, I finally came to the conclusion that there was nothing to catch here, and the best action would be to lock myself in my apartment, crawl under the covers and sleep peacefully. He quickly went downstairs, unlocked the front door, locked the latch, went into his room, and lay down on the bed. I calmed down, lay down, and after thinking about the situation, I even felt a little funny. An adult guy, 27 years old, after all, was afraid of the darkness and the inappropriate actions of his drunken neighbors. Thinking about this, I began to gradually fall asleep, when suddenly the doorbell rang. All my thoughts about the comical nature of the situation disappeared in the time it took to press the bell button twice. I got up, went to the door and looked through the peephole. Opposite my apartment stood their son, down. One hand was reaching for the call button, and with the other he was actively picking his nose. I was even glad to see him. It would have been much worse not to have found anyone in the entrance at all. Then the situation would clearly remind me of a classic horror film from the 90s. Another call distracted me from my own thoughts of, if only, and I, once again convinced of his presence, turned on the light and opened the front door. "What?" I asked and went out to him on the platform. Vanya at that very moment was busy removing a rather large green substance from his nose, which he put into his mouth with a blissful face and, after chewing, swallowed. I almost vomited, but, oddly enough, my emetic the reflex attracted his attention and, without waiting for his actions, I took Vanya by the sleeve and, closing my door with the key, led him towards his apartment. My eyes got used to the darkness, and, unfortunately, I wasn't smart enough to take a flashlight with me. Trailing behind me up the stairs, he uttered unrelated words and incomprehensible grunts. It was clear that he did not want to go home, although he did not resist too much. And so, we came almost to the apartment itself, the front door of which was wide open. But due to the lack of light, both in the apartment and in the entrance, nothing was visible. We both stopped 2 meters from the apartment. The silence was broken by Venino's heavy breathing. At this moment, a feeling of anxiety and worry came over me again. This damn apartment seemed to smell of horror. The feeling that someone was looking at me from the darkness drove me crazy. I looked at Vanya. The outline of his face showed that he was looking into the darkness of the doorway. "Dad," he said. His voice echoed through the entrance and silence. I looked as hard as I could, but didn't see anyone. "Well, Van, go home," I said quietly, almost in a whisper, and pushed him forward, and I myself began to move in the opposite direction, towards the stairs. I was ashamed that I had drifted off and was, as it were, sending an unhealthy kid on reconnaissance. But to act otherwise, I didn't have the nerves. The distance between me and Vanya increased. He stood and looked forward, and I walked away. Against the background of blackness, I saw his receding silhouette. Suddenly Vanya turned around, and in a satisfied voice very loudly and clearly uttered a phrase that I did not want to hear. "Daddy ate mommy," he said, and laughed loudly with imbecile laughter. I couldn't believe my ears. The mere fact that he issued a phrase that carried some meaning is already a rarity. And here, in such a situation, to say this. My heart almost stopped. With a stunned expression on my face, I stopped and looked for a rational explanation for what was happening. "What?" I said in a voice that was not my own, and continued to slowly move my back towards the stairs. But the only response was, "Gigi," an incomprehensible muttering. Approaching the first step, almost falling, I began to feel for the next one with my foot, not taking my eyes off the already barely visible silhouette, when suddenly, with a sharp short sound of some kind of fuss, he disappeared. At the same time, the heavy breathing that Ivan was accustomed to also disappeared. The nerves just burst in my head. Turning around with lightning speed, I covered the distance to the stairwell in one leap, catching my hand on the railing so as not to slam into the wall. I twisted my ankle, but given the general situation, it didn't cause any particular inconvenience. By the way, I was wearing house slippers. In the time between my landing and further movement, I managed to hear footsteps coming from the direction of their apartment. This gave me a strong incentive not to stop, and also quickly go down to my floor. In my head, I did not replay the possible situations of what was happening there. There were no thoughts at all except one, to quickly get to my apartment, to my shelter. Running up to the door, frantically, in a very hurry, he began to take a stack of keys out of his pocket. Since it was dark, I had to find the one I needed by touch. Garage, storage room, Dasha. I cursed myself for carrying all this with me in one big bundle. Meanwhile, the steps were approaching and were already clearly audible on my floor. Someone has already descended and is heading towards me. I wanted to cry. I wanted the light to come on so I could see that nothing bad was happening. I wanted to wake up and understand that everything that was happening was just a bad dream. "Here he is," I shouted out loud, and with shaking hands I drove the key into the lock. Turning counterclockwise, I took a step back, opened the door and flew through the threshold. "That's it? I'm safe? All I have to do is close the front door and that's it." Turning to face her, I sharply reached for the handle, grabbed it and was about to pull it towards me, but the human silhouette was 1/3 of a meter away from me. I felt the movement of air caused by his breathing immediately and almost vomited. I have never felt such a disgusting stench in my life. The one who stood opposite me was motionless. Taking an impressive step back, I began to feel with my hand for the switch on the wall. The silhouette also took a step forward, crossing the threshold. I was so absorbed in the situation that even the feeling of fear left me for a moment. But it was replaced by a panicky natural horror, which almost caused him to lose consciousness. Because I finally found the switch and flicked it on, turning on the light. Half of his hair was either fallen out or torn out. The skin had an unnaturally pale color with visible blue veins. The eyes are completely black, without white and iris. Starting from the lower jaw and ending with the shoes of my drunk neighbor, everything was covered in blood. His open mouth, with blood rarely dripping onto the floor, revealed bloody teeth, which he clearly did not have in full. The madness was evident in his face. I looked lower and noticed that in his hand he was holding a chewed-off fat hand with his wives. We stood and looked at each other for about 5 seconds. Suddenly, a growl resembling the growl of a huge bulldog came from his mouth. I immediately came to my senses, and a distinct "run" sounded in my head. Rushing into my room, I slammed the door with a bang and grabbed the doorknob with my hands. With a furious roar, the neighbor, if you can call him that, although it would be more appropriate to call him a monster, rushed after me. Running up to the door, contrary to my expectations, he did not try to open the door by pulling the handle. He scratched her with his nails, banged his head, tried to gnaw her with his teeth like a dog. And I sat pressed against the door, holding the handle with my hands, thinking that my cell phone was in my jacket in the hallway, that if I let go of the door to reach and turn on the light, then this monster would certainly enter my room, and he will devour me just as he ate his wife and his child. Having lost track of time, listening to my neighbor scratching, growling, gnawing, and hammering on the door, I sat there until the morning. As it began to get light, I heard the door of my neighbor, a lonely elderly woman, open on my floor. I got up from the floor and screamed with all my might, "Run!" The neighbor stopped making sounds of activity for a while. Then I heard my neighbor scream, which lasted a couple of seconds and then died down. Everything was like delirium. How long I sat like that, I have no idea. I only know that after dealing with my neighbor, the monster disappeared somewhere. After some time, the door was opened by police officers. Then there was an investigation, now closed, in which I acted as the main suspect, but due to the lack of evidence, I am still at large. My neighbor was found with her throat gnawed out in a pool of her own blood. In the apartment on the floor above, they found the wife of a drunk neighbor dismembered and scattered throughout the apartment. His son's body lay in the hallway, and his head, with an idiotic grin on his face, was in the hallway outside the apartment. The neighbor himself was never found, but I am sure that somewhere in the darkness of the night, he wanders like a stray dog. And since there is no body, it means he is still alive. And that means he eats, and we already know what his favorite dish is.